Paul Harrison was no longer the strong man he used to be. At 75, he felt the weight of age in every movement, in his creaking joints, and in muscles that no longer responded as they once did. However, the deepest pain was not physical, it was the absence of Evelyn, his wife of over 50 years, which had consumed him daily since her death 5 years ago. The house where he now lived, solitary and silent, seemed like a mausoleum, filled with memories that echoed through every empty hallway. He spent his mornings sitting in the armchair by the living room window, watching the quiet street of his small town, his heart heavy with a longing that never seemed to diminish. It was in that same armchair that he found something that would change the course of the coming months, a letter. Not just any letter, but one written by Evelyn before she passed, a simple note, yet filled with meaning. "Paul, don't let our story be lost. Go back to the lake. Rebuild the house. There, you'll find what you need." The words resonated like a call, an echo from the past, and Paul felt his heart race. The house by the lake was where they had spent their first years of marriage, before they had children, before the responsibilities of adult life consumed them. The place was sacred to them, a kind of refuge from difficult times and emotional storms. However, over the years, the place had been abandoned. With Evelyn's health deteriorating, they never returned. Now, with that letter in hand, Paul knew what he had to do. He looked around the living room, his eyes fixed on the picture frames with images of the two of them, still young and full of dreams. He knew it wouldn't be easy, the house was in ruins, time and nature had done their work. But within him, something stronger than reason drove him forward. It was the need to honor his wife's memory, to finish what they had started together so many years ago. Determined, Paul began making preparations. His children, David and Laura, were the first to express their disapproval. "Dad, you can't do this," David argued, his face serious, his eyes tired. "You're not young enough for this kind of thing. The lake is far, and the house is destroyed. Please, be sensible." Laura, sitting next to her brother, simply nodded in agreement, visibly concerned. She had inherited her mother's pragmatic side, always planning, always cautious. "What do you want me to do?" Paul responded, his voice firm but heavy with sadness. "Stay here? Watch TV? Wait for time to pass while your mother's memory fades along with that house?" The silence in the room was deafening. David and Laura exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. Finally, it was Laura who broke the silence. "We understand, Dad. We know it's hard for you. But we want you to think about your health, your safety. We don't think this is the best way to deal with grief." "Grief?" Paul let out a bitter laugh. "You think I'm dealing with grief? Dealing with grief is moving on. I don't want to move on. I want to finish what we started together." The children couldn't convince their father, and after a long debate, he left for the lake alone, ignoring the family's concerns. The road back to the place was full of memories, the winding path through hills and forests, the distant sound of a stream accompanying him, bringing back memories of picnics and walks he had taken with Evelyn. When he arrived at the lake, the sight hit him like a knife to the chest. The house was in complete decay. The roof had collapsed in some parts, the walls covered in ivy and moss. Nature had reclaimed what was hers, and for a moment, Paul doubted his decision. Could he really rebuild all of this alone? Sitting on the hood of the car, he took a deep breath, looking at the lake in front of him. The water, calm and crystal clear, reflected the blue sky, and the fresh breeze touched his face, bringing a vague sense of comfort. Paul closed his eyes and tried to remember what it was like to be there with Evelyn. Her laughter, the sound of her voice, the feeling of having her by his side, it all seemed so distant, almost unreal. As he reflected, he heard the sound of an engine in the distance. It was Jack's truck, the young carpenter he had met at the local hardware store. Jack had been reluctant at first, but seeing Paul's determination, he agreed to help with the reconstruction. As he got out of the truck, Jack looked at the house and let out a low whistle. "Yeah, this is going to be a lot of work," Jack commented, with a smirk. "That's why I'm paying you," Paul replied, trying to hide his insecurity behind a joke. Jack laughed, and the two began discussing the plan. The young carpenter, with his messy hair and observant gaze, seemed to see beyond what Paul was saying. He understood that, for the older man, this wasn't just a project. It was a life mission. And, in a way, Jack had his own reasons for being there, though he wasn't ready to share them yet. In the days that followed, Paul and Jack began the arduous task of demolishing what remained of the old house. Every hammer blow echoed with a mix of destruction and renewal. Paul felt the weight of his age in every movement, but his determination pushed him forward. He needed to do this, not just for Evelyn, but for himself. It was as if, by rebuilding the house, he was also rebuilding pieces of himself that had been lost over time. Jack, in turn, watched the older man with silent admiration. Though he didn't say much, he knew there was more to the story. Paul wasn't just an elderly man trying to fulfill a dream, he was someone who refused to let the memories of a great love fade with time. And that moved Jack in ways he wasn't ready to admit. The tension between the past and the present, between the pain of loss and the hope of renewal, filled every moment. The house, which once symbolized the love and happiness of Paul and Evelyn, now became a stage for Paul's internal battle, and perhaps for Jack's as well. As the first day of work came to an end, Paul looked at the lake once more, feeling the exhaustion in his bones, but with a small spark of satisfaction in his heart. He knew there was still much to be done. But in that moment, with Jack's company and the first boards removed, Paul felt, for the first time in years, that maybe it was possible to find a bit of peace amid all the chaos. In the following days, Paul and Jack fell into a quiet routine. Each morning, Paul woke early, even though his bones protested with the pain of a poorly slept night. The sun rose slowly over the lake, and the morning breeze was the only thing that offered some relief to his tired muscles. Jack arrived around 8 in his old truck, loaded with tools and a focused expression. The young carpenter was an enigma to Paul. He worked skillfully, his calloused hands moving with precision, but there was something more. Jack rarely talked about his life. The few conversations they had during work breaks were short and practical, always revolving around the project. Paul, however, sensed that Jack's silence hid more than just a reserved personality. With every hammer blow, Paul saw memories of Evelyn flash through his mind like an old movie. He remembered the first time he saw her, dancing alone at a college party, the radiant smile she gave him when their eyes met. He remembered the first night they spent in the lake house, still young and full of dreams, unaware that time would one day pull them away from that place. As the old boards of the house fell one by one, revealing a structure corroded by time, Paul felt a mix of sadness and relief. Each piece removed seemed to erase a bit of the pain, but it also brought back happy memories, the laughter around the campfire, the long conversations on the porch as the sun set on the horizon. "Do you have children?" Paul asked Jack one afternoon during a lunch break. Jack looked at him, surprised by the sudden question. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his arm and shrugged. "No. I don't." His response was short, but Paul felt the weight behind it. There was an uncomfortable silence between them. Paul knew there was something unsaid, something Jack preferred to keep hidden. He respected the young man's choice, but his curiosity about Jack's personal life grew with each passing day. That same afternoon, while dismantling the porch, Paul caught a glimpse of what was going on in Jack's mind. The carpenter, focused on his work, suddenly stopped and stood looking at the lake, his eyes fixed on the reflection of the trees in the water. "I used to come to a place like this with my dad," he said quietly. "When I was a kid. He loved to fish." Paul remained silent, waiting for Jack to continue. But the young man just shook his head and went back to work, as if regretting having said anything. Days turned into weeks, and the old house slowly began to take shape again. Jack proved to be a skilled carpenter, with a natural talent for restoring what seemed lost. He patiently explained each step of the process to Paul, from repairing the roof beams to selecting the right boards for the floor. Paul, in turn, helped where he could, even though his hands weren't as steady as they used to be. One morning, while Jack was adjusting the beams of the new foundation, Paul decided to take a walk around the lake. It was something he used to do with Evelyn, and only now, with the house beginning to come back to life, did he feel able to revisit those places. The trail they once walked together was covered in fallen leaves, and the soft sound of the wind in the trees seemed to whisper forgotten stories. As he walked, Paul passed through a clearing where he and Evelyn had once camped. It was there that she first told him about her dream of building a house in that place. They were young and in love, and the idea seemed like a fairy tale. They never imagined the challenges that would come, the daily struggles to balance work, family, and the love they had for each other. He sat on a rock by the lake, watching the gentle waves lap against the shore. The sun reflected on the water, creating a golden glow that transported him back to that distant afternoon when he and Evelyn, lying on the grass, planned every detail of the house. Her dream was still alive, waiting to be fulfilled. As Paul reflected, a specific memory flooded his mind, vivid as if it had happened the day before. It was their 10th wedding anniversary, and Evelyn surprised him with a picnic by the lake. She prepared all his favorite foods, and as they ate, she talked about the future, about the children they would still have and the many nights they would spend together in that house. He remembered how she took his hand, her eyes shining, and said, "Promise me you'll never give up on us, Paul. No matter what happens." He promised. And now, after all these years, he felt like he was finally keeping that promise. When Paul returned to the house, Jack had already finished raising the new roof beams. The young carpenter seemed pleased with the progress, but Paul noticed a change in his behavior. Jack was more reserved than usual, and that night, as they had dinner together, he finally opened up a little more. "You know, when my dad died," Jack began, looking at his plate of food, "I didn't handle it very well. We fought a lot, you know? I felt like he never understood me. And then, suddenly, he was gone. I was left with all these unsaid things, all these regrets. And I think that's why I'm here." Paul stayed quiet, allowing Jack to speak at his own pace. He understood what the young man was feeling. He, too, carried regrets, though his were different. The difference was that Paul had time to resolve his conflicts with Evelyn. But even so, the pain of loss was the same. Sometimes, rebuilding something isn't just about what's in front of us, Paul said softly. It's about what's inside of us. It's about making sense of the things we've lost. Jack nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The two men, from different generations, shared the same pain, the same desire to find redemption in what they were building. And in that moment, without saying another word, Paul knew that Jack was there for more than just the work. He was searching for something, just like he was. In the days that followed, the house continued to take shape. Paul, despite his age and physical limitations, felt revitalized by the progress. Every new nail they hammered, every board they put in place, was a step closer to fulfilling the promise he had made to Evelyn. However, there was still much to be done. The exterior of the house was nearly complete, but the interior was still an empty shell, full of holes and memories. Paul knew that the hardest part was yet to come, not the physical work, but the emotional one. Entering that house, smelling the wood, hearing the echoes of Evelyn's laughter in the walls, it would be a test of his strength that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The days at the lake became almost therapeutic for Paul. The constant noise of hammers and saws, mixed with the soft sound of the water lapping at the shore, brought him a sense of order amid the emotional chaos. Rebuilding the house was more than just physical labor, it was a healing process, an attempt to deal with the wounds Evelyn had left behind. Yet, despite the visible progress, something inside Paul still resisted being fixed. Every nail he drove into the wood seemed to bury deeper the memories of what had been lost. Jack, on the other hand, also seemed lost in his own thoughts. He wasn't the type to share much about himself, but Paul began to notice small signs of emotional fatigue. The young carpenter, despite his competence, often drifted into distant gazes, as if he were battling something he wasn't ready to admit. During long lunch breaks or at night, when they both sat by the lake, the silence between them was heavy with things unsaid. One afternoon, while they were installing the windows of the house, Paul broke the silence. "You never talk much about what brought you here," Paul said, adjusting the window level, his eyes focused on the work. Jack stopped for a moment, his tired eyes gazing at the horizon, before turning his attention back to the glass he was holding. "There's not much to say." The short reply didn't surprise Paul, but Jack's tone suggested more. "Everyone has a story, Jack. And if you're here, helping to rebuild this," Paul gestured toward the partially rebuilt house in front of them, "maybe you're trying to build something inside yourself too." Jack hesitated, the muscles in his shoulders tense as if carrying an invisible weight. He carefully lowered the glass and sighed. "When I was a kid, my father had a house like this. Small but cozy. He built everything with his own hands. I admired how he made it seem easy, like every hammer blow was an extension of his own will. But..." Jack paused, his words catching in his throat. "We fought a lot. I always felt like he didn't understand me, like he never accepted my choices. And when he died, I never got the chance to make things right with him." Paul nodded silently, feeling the weight of Jack's words. He knew what it was like to carry regrets, to lose someone before resolving what needed to be said. Jack, in a way, was dealing with the same shadows Paul was. But the young carpenter was still trying to figure out how to handle those wounds. "I understand how you feel," Paul said softly. "Evelyn and I had our tough moments too. But one thing I've learned over the years is that time waits for no one. We have to find a way to make peace, even when the person is no longer here." Jack remained silent, but Paul could see that his words had touched something deep within him. As the days passed, the pace of work began to change. The house, which once seemed like nothing more than a ruin, now began to look like a home again. The roof was almost complete, the windows were installed, and the exterior walls were starting to be covered with a new layer of wood, carefully chosen by Paul, who wanted to maintain the rustic essence that he and Evelyn had loved so much. But with every bit of progress, Paul's memories became more vivid. One afternoon, while Jack was busy installing the interior doors, Paul decided to enter the main living room, now partially restored. The newly installed wooden floor creaked under his feet as he walked to the old fireplace where he and Evelyn had warmed themselves on cold winter nights. He sat down on one of the toolboxes, gazing at the fireplace with tear-filled eyes. It was there, in that same room, that they had one of their most heated arguments. He had been promoted at work, which meant less time for the family, less time for the lake. Evelyn had been disappointed, feeling that they were drifting further away from the dream of spending more time there. "This place was supposed to be our refuge," she had said that night, her eyes shining with sadness. "But it feels like it's getting further away." Paul hadn't been able to understand the depth of her words back then. Now, years later, with the sound of the wind blowing through the cracks of the partially rebuilt house, he understood perfectly. The lake and the house were more than just a place. They were an anchor, a reminder that their love could withstand time and distance, as long as they both dedicated themselves to it. While Paul was lost in his memories, he heard the sound of Jack's footsteps approaching. "Are you okay, Paul?" Jack asked, his face showing concern. Paul smiled faintly, wiping his eyes with the tip of his fingers. I'm fine. Just remembering some things. It seems like this place holds a lot of stories, Jack commented, sitting next to Paul. More than I imagined. It does. Paul looked around the room, now full of life again. And each one of them is important. I think that's why I'm so determined to finish this. It's not just for Evelyn. It's for both of us. Jack was silent for a moment, absorbing Paul's words. He looked at the ceiling beams, now firmly in place, and at the freshly repaired walls. The house was coming back to life, just like the stories it held. But at the same time, Jack knew that true restoration didn't happen only in what could be seen and touched. It was something internal, something Paul, like Jack, was still trying to understand. As the days went by, the friendship between Paul and Jack began to strengthen. They didn't talk much about their pain or regrets, but there was a silent understanding between them. The physical work kept them focused, but it was during the breaks, in the conversations by the campfire at the lake's edge, that they truly connected. Slowly, Jack began to open up more, sharing small stories from his childhood and the tensions he had with his father. You know, I always wanted to be a musician, Jack confessed one night, surprising Paul. But my father, he thought it was a waste of time. He wanted me to follow in his footsteps, to build things with my hands, just like he did. Paul, surprised by the revelation, looked at Jack with curiosity. So why didn't you pursue music? Jack sighed, throwing a stone into the water, watching the ripples form. I guess I never had enough courage. I never believed I'd be good enough. And in the end, I ended up here, building things, just like my father wanted. Paul remained silent for a while, considering what Jack had said. There was a deep sadness in the young man's words, a kind of resignation that Paul knew all too well. He himself had given up on so many dreams over the years, sacrificing parts of himself to meet the demands of life and work. But now, nearing 80, he was beginning to realize the true cost of that. Sometimes, the dreams we leave behind come back to haunt us, Paul said, finally breaking the silence. But there's still time, Jack. There's always time to go back. Jack looked at him, his young face marked by the worries of life. He didn't respond, but Paul saw in his eyes that those words had touched something inside him. The next morning, work on the house continued as usual, but there was a new energy between the two men. Jack, though still reserved, seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Paul, for his part, was more determined than ever to finish the house, not just to honor Evelyn's memory but to find the peace he had been searching for. With the roof nearly finished, Paul began to focus on the more delicate parts of the reconstruction. The kitchen, which had been the heart of the house, was where he and Evelyn had spent countless nights preparing meals together, laughing and talking about the future. Recreating that space, so full of memories, was particularly difficult. Paul spent days measuring, cutting, and adjusting the shelves, trying to ensure that everything was exactly how Evelyn liked it. He knew the house was taking shape, but he also knew that no matter how much he restored every detail, it would never be the same without her there. As each corner of the house came back to life, Evelyn's absence became even more present. One morning, while Paul was working on the kitchen counter installation, Jack entered with a sack of cement on his shoulder. He observed Paul for a moment before approaching. "The kitchen's looking incredible," Jack said as he set the sack down. "I think Evelyn would be proud of you." Paul, surprised by the comment, stopped what he was doing and looked at the young carpenter. There was something different in the way Jack spoke of Evelyn now, as if he were connecting more deeply to the story Paul carried. "I hope so," Paul replied, his voice filled with emotion. "She always loved this place. It was her dream, you know?" Jack nodded, and for a moment, the two fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. You know, Paul. I never said this, but I think I understand a bit of what you're going through, Jack began, his voice hesitant. When my dad died, I felt like I lost more than just a parent. I lost a part of myself, a part that I never managed to get back. Paul looked at Jack, realizing that the young man was finally starting to open his heart. I think we all feel that way at some point, Paul replied. Losing someone we love is like losing a piece of who we are. But somehow, we have to keep going. Jack sighed, crossing his arms as he looked around the kitchen. I think that's why I'm here. I never managed to fix what was broken with my father. And maybe, by helping you rebuild this. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Maybe it'll help me find some kind of peace too. Paul nodded silently. There was something deeply comforting in knowing that Jack was there, not just as a worker, but as someone who was also seeking redemption. In a way, they were rebuilding more than just a house. They were rebuilding parts of themselves. The days passed quickly, and the lake house finally began to feel habitable again. The roof was complete, the interior walls were painted, and the furniture, though simple, began to fill the empty spaces. Jack and Paul worked side by side every day, and over time, the silence between them turned into a kind of mutual understanding. There was no need for many words. The sound of hammers, saws, and the wind blowing over the lake was enough. One afternoon, while Jack was busy with the final touches in the bedroom, Paul decided to take a walk to the old pier. He and Evelyn had spent hours there, fishing or simply watching the stars reflected in the water. But now, the pier was old, with some loose and rotting boards. He knew it would need to be rebuilt, but he hesitated to start. The pier, more than any other part of the property, was where he felt Evelyn's presence the most. As he approached the lake, Paul felt a wave of nostalgia. The soft sound of the water hitting the rocks brought back memories of warm summer nights when he and Evelyn sat there talking late into the night, laughing and dreaming about the future. Now, the future felt so uncertain, and the present, empty. Paul knelt beside the pier, smelling the damp wood. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, it felt like Evelyn was there with him, as if the wind blowing over the lake was her voice, whispering words of comfort. I miss you so much, he whispered, his heart heavy with longing. The sound of light footsteps on the grass pulled him from his thoughts. When Paul turned around, he saw Jack approaching, his face showing concern. Are you okay? Jack asked, stopping a few feet away. Paul nodded, though he knew the answer wasn't that simple. I'm fine. Just thinking about the past. About this place. Jack walked over and sat down next to Paul on the ground, crossing his legs. This place must have been amazing when you two lived here. Paul smiled faintly. It was. Every inch of this land has a story. But the pier. He paused, looking at the old structure in front of them. This place was her favorite. I think that's why it's been so hard for me to rebuild. Jack looked at the pier for a moment, thoughtful, before speaking. Maybe you don't need to rebuild everything. Some things are better left as they were. They're memories we carry with us. Jack's words surprised Paul. He had always thought he needed to fix every part of the house, every part of the land, as if he were trying to repair the failures of the past. But maybe Jack was right. Maybe some things should stay as they were, as a tribute to what was still important in his memory. They sat there for a while longer, watching the sun begin to set on the horizon. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the lake reflected the colors so perfectly it looked like a mirror. The silence between them was comfortable, and for the first time in a long time, Paul felt a sense of peace. When they returned to the house, already in the early evening, Paul knew that something had changed inside him. He still missed Evelyn, he still felt the weight of the loss, but now there was an acceptance that he hadn't had before. The house was almost finished, and with it, Paul felt that he was finally nearing the end of a long and painful journey. In the days that followed, they completed the final touches on the house. The simple furniture was placed, and the exterior received a new coat of paint. The place finally felt like a home again, a place where old memories could coexist with new ones. Jack and Paul worked in silence, but the understanding between them was deep. Finally, on the last day of work, Paul and Jack stepped back to take in the full view of the lake house. The construction was complete. It was a symbol of dedication, perseverance, and, above all, love. Paul turned to Jack and extended his hand. "Thank you, Jack. For everything." Jack shook Paul's hand, a small smile on his face. "It was an honor, Paul. I hope this place brings you the peace you deserve." The last month passed quickly. The house was finally finished, a perfect replica of what had once been Paul and Evelyn's refuge. Every detail, from the wooden beams to the windows, held a memory, a story that Paul had patiently shared with Jack throughout their work. Yet, even with everything in place, there was still something Paul needed to face: the farewell. The night of the inauguration arrived with a starry sky and an air of nostalgia. Paul decided to organize a small ceremony, not to celebrate the completion of the house, but to honor Evelyn's memory and all the moments they had shared in that place. He had invited his children, David and Laura, who, although initially skeptical, now saw how much rebuilding the house had given their father a new purpose in life. Along with them were a few close friends from town, and of course, Jack, who had become more than just a helper. He was now a true friend. As evening fell, people began to arrive. The house was lit by soft lights, creating a warm and peaceful atmosphere. Paul, standing on the porch, watched each person approach with a mix of emotions. He knew that this moment was not just the end of a project, but the closing of a painful chapter in his life. Yet, instead of feeling sadness, he felt gratitude. "Are you ready for this?" Jack asked, standing beside him, his hands in his pockets. Paul looked at Jack, smiled softly, and nodded. "I think so. It's time to let go." Paul's words were simple, but they carried deep meaning. Over the months of rebuilding, he had learned that he couldn't hold on to the past forever. Evelyn would always be with him, in every corner of that house, but it was time to move forward, to allow new stories to be created there. As people gathered on the lawn in front of the house, Paul stepped up onto the porch and asked for everyone's attention. "I'd like to thank each of you for being here today," Paul began, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. "This house has always been very special to me and to Evelyn. It was where we built our life together, where we shared our dreams, and where we sought refuge from life's challenges. Rebuilding it was more than just work, it was a way to honor everything we lived through." Paul paused, taking a deep breath as he looked at the house behind him. The lights reflected in the windows, giving the building a soft, almost magical glow. "But I've realized that I can't live on memories alone. Evelyn was always a visionary, someone who believed in the future as much as the past. And that's why I'm here today, not just to celebrate what we had, but to make room for what's yet to come." Paul's children, who stood beside him, looked deeply moved. They knew how much this place meant to their father, and now, they finally understood why he was so determined to rebuild it. Jack, watching the scene from a respectful distance, couldn't help but reflect on how much this project had also changed his own life. He had come there just looking for work, but he found something much bigger. His friendship with Paul had helped him face his own demons, and now, with the house finished, Jack felt like he had restored parts of himself as well. After Paul finished speaking, the ceremony continued with soft conversations, laughter, and memories being shared among the guests. The atmosphere was light, almost as if Evelyn's presence was there, blessing each moment. As the night fully descended, Paul and Jack decided to take a walk down to the pier. The full moon was out, and its reflection on the lake created a scene of tranquil beauty. The pier, which Paul had decided not to fully restore, still held some of its old boards, now mixed with new ones, symbolizing the blend of past and present. "I've thought a lot about what you said, Jack," Paul began as they walked. "About leaving some things as they are. I think you were right. We can't fix everything. Some things need to be remembered just as they were." Jack smiled slightly, nodding. "Sometimes, the best way to honor the past is not to try to change it. Just let it exist alongside us." The two walked in silence to the end of the pier, where Paul sat down, letting his legs dangle over the water. Jack did the same, and together, they watched the lake in silence, as the stars twinkled in the sky. "You know, Jack," Paul said after a while, "I never asked you what you plan to do next. Now that the house is finished and all." Jack shrugged, thoughtful. "I don't know. I think it's time to move on. Maybe go back to music. My dad might not have understood, but I think it's something I need to do for myself." Paul smiled, pleased with the answer. "I think Evelyn would have liked that. She always believed people should follow what makes their hearts beat faster." The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with meaning. Paul knew that the house project had come to an end, but he also knew that the friendship between him and Jack was something that would endure beyond the walls they had rebuilt together. As the soft breeze from the lake blew, Paul felt a deep peace settle within him. He had fulfilled his promise, not just to Evelyn, but to himself. The lake house was ready, not just as a monument to the past, but as a symbol that life, even with all its losses, can be rebuilt. And that night, under the starry sky and the reflection of the lights on the water, Paul felt that he had finally found what he had been searching for: peace. And that was another amazing story. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share. These steps are very important for the continuity of the channel. A big hug and see you soon.